The trap is sprung. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night. Small creatures scurried through the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the tall alien trees. Logan crouched near his trap, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. He had been setting traps like this for weeks. Something, or someone, had been stealing food from the settlement, and the villagers were growing restless. Tonight felt different, though. The air was colder, the forest quieter. Logan's instincts told him that this might be the night he caught the thief. The trap was simple but effective. A large net rigged to a pressure plate, hidden under a thick layer of leaves. If anything stepped on it, the net would spring up and trap them. Logan didn't know what to expect. A wild animal, maybe, or one of the strange creatures the settlers whispered about. As the hours passed, Logan kept himself awake by sharpening his knife. His hands moved automatically, the blade glinting in the faint moonlight. He didn't believe in the ghost stories the other settlers told, but he couldn't deny the feeling of unease that crept over him whenever he was out here alone. Then it happened. The trap snapped shut with a loud whoosh, followed by a high-pitched, almost musical cry. Logan jumped to his feet, his heart racing. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the trap. What he saw made him freeze. Caught in the net was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was humanoid, but its skin glowed faintly blue, like the light of the stars. Long, silver hair cascaded down its back, and its large, glowing eyes blinked rapidly in the harsh beam of the flashlight. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human, either. It was an alien. Logan approached cautiously, his knife in hand. The creature thrashed against the net, its movements frantic. It hissed at him, a strange, guttural sound that sent a chill down his spine. He could see its sharp teeth, its fingers tipped with small claws. It looked dangerous, but there was something else in its eyes. Fear. The alien girl didn't seem like a monster. She seemed afraid. Logan stopped a few feet away, lowering his flashlight slightly. "Hey," he said softly, his voice steadied despite the hammering of his heart. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien didn't respond, of course. It didn't understand him. But it stopped thrashing for a moment, watching him warily. Logan could see that it was trembling, its chest rising and falling quickly. He crouched down, trying to make himself look less threatening. "You're not what I expected," he muttered. "What are you doing out here?" The alien hissed again, but it was quieter this time. Logan noticed that the net had left marks on its arms and legs where it had struggled. He felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. He had just wanted to catch whoever was stealing from the settlement. "You're scared," Logan said, more to himself than to the alien. "You think I'm going to hurt you, don't you?" The alien's eyes narrowed, as if it understood his tone, if not his words. It pulled against the net again, but its movements were weaker now. Logan realized that it was exhausted. He hesitated. What was he supposed to do with it? The settlement would want answers, and they wouldn't be gentle about getting them. If he brought this creature back with him, it would probably end up in a cage, or worse. Logan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement in the trees. He tensed, his knife ready, but nothing emerged from the shadows. Still, it was a reminder that he wasn't alone out here. If there was one alien, there could be more. He turned back to the girl in the net. Her glowing eyes were fixed on him, wide with a mix of fear and defiance. Logan sighed. He didn't know what she was, where she had come from, or why she was here. But he did know one thing. She wasn't going to hurt him, and he wasn't going to hurt her. Logan stood up and took a step closer. The alien flinched, but he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Slowly, he reached for the net. "I'm letting you go," he said quietly, "but you better not make me regret it." The alien girl didn't move as he cut through the ropes. The net fell away, and for a moment, she just lay there, staring up at him. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, she scrambled to her feet and backed away. Logan didn't follow. He watched as she disappeared into the darkness, her glowing form fading into the trees. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the spot where she had been. He knew this wasn't over. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from, it was only the beginning. And Logan had a feeling his life was about to change forever. Misunderstandings and fear. Arca crouched in the shadows of the alien forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The human had let her go. But why? She had heard the stories from the elders. Humans were predators, cruel and cunning. They took what they wanted and destroyed everything in their path. Yet this one had released her. She clutched her injured arm, her glowing blue skin dimmed with exhaustion. The net had cut deep, but she couldn't stop now. She had to get back to her siblings. They were waiting for her in the caves, hungry and afraid. Arca had risked everything to steal food for them. And now she had failed. Her stomach growled, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten. She glanced back through the trees, where the human's campfire flickered in the distance. She could smell the strange, enticing scent of cooked meat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the human. But another part of her hesitated. He hadn't killed her. He hadn't even chased her. Arca shook her head and pressed on, weaving through the thick foliage. She couldn't afford to trust him, or anyone. Logan sat by his fire, staring into the flames. The alien girl had looked terrified, as if she expected him to attack her. He couldn't shake the image of her wide, glowing eyes, filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "Probably thinks I'm some kind of monster," he muttered to himself. He poked at the fire with a stick, frustrated. He'd spent weeks trying to protect the settlement from whoever was raiding their supplies, and now he wasn't even sure he wanted to. That alien girl didn't seem like a threat, just scared and desperate. Logan's stomach growled, and he grabbed a piece of dried meat from his pack. As he chewed, his mind wandered back to the strange creature. What had she been doing out here? Was she alone, or were there more of her kind nearby? The thought made him uneasy. If there were more, and they weren't as harmless as she seemed, the settlement could be in real danger. He sighed and leaned back against a tree. Maybe he should just forget about it. Let her go and focus on protecting his people. But something told him it wasn't that simple. Arca reached the cave just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. She slipped inside, her body aching with every step. Arca. Her younger siblings rushed to her, their small, glowing forms barely visible in the dim light. They clung to her legs, their voices a mix of relief and worry. "Did you bring food?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. Arca's heart sank. She shook her head, unable to meet their eyes. "Not yet," she said softly, "but I'll find something. I promise." They didn't complain, but the disappointment on their faces was clear. Arca felt a pang of guilt. She had to do better. As the children settled back into their makeshift bedding, Arca sat by the cave's entrance, watching the forest below. The human's campfire was barely visible in the distance, a tiny dot of light against the dark trees. She didn't understand him. Why had he let her go? Humans were supposed to be brutal and heartless, but he had been different. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. She sighed, pressing a hand to her abdomen. She couldn't afford to waste time thinking about him. Her family needed food, and the human settlement was the only place to find it. Arca closed her eyes, her mind racing. If she went back, she would have to be more careful. The human might not be so kind next time. But something told her he wasn't like the others. Back at the camp, Logan was startled awake by the sound of movement nearby. He grabbed his knife and stood, scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness, he heard a soft, musical sound, almost like a question. Logan lowered his knife slightly. "It's you, isn't it?" The alien girl stepped into the edge of the firelight, her glowing blue skin casting a faint halo around her. She was holding her arm, her posture tense but not threatening. Logan's eyes narrowed. "You're back." She didn't respond, of course, but her eyes flicked to the food by the fire, and Logan understood. "You're hungry," he said. He crouched down slowly, pulling a piece of cooked meat from the fire. "You want this?" The girl's gaze darted between him and the food. She hesitated, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Logan held the meat out to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Go on. I'm not going to hurt you." After a long moment, she took a cautious step forward, then another. Finally, she reached out with a trembling hand and snatched the food from his grasp. She backed away quickly, retreating to the edge of the firelight. Logan watched as she devoured the meat in seconds, her sharp teeth tearing into it with desperate hunger. As she finished, she looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with something new. Not fear. Curiosity. Logan smiled faintly. "Well, that's a start." The escape attempt. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the air thick with tension. Arca crouched in the underbrush, her sharp ears picking up the faintest rustle of leaves in the distance. She wasn't sure why she had returned to the humans' camp. Curiosity, desperation, or perhaps a dangerous mix of both. But now she was trapped again, her path blocked by the very creature she feared. Logan stood a few paces away, his back to her, carefully stoking the fire. He didn't know she was there yet. The flickering light danced across his face, his features hard but oddly calm. He didn't look like the bloodthirsty monster her people had described, but Arca couldn't afford to trust appearances. Her fingers brushed against the small device hidden in her belt, a pulse detonator. It was her last resort, a tool her elders had strictly forbidden her from using unless her life was in imminent danger. But now, with hunger gnawing at her and her siblings waiting for her return, the device felt like her only option. She activated the detonator with a soft click, the blue orb in her hand humming faintly. The sound wasn't loud, but Logan froze instantly, his instincts sharp. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the faint glow behind him. "I know you're there," Logan said, his voice calm but firm. He stood slowly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "You don't have to hide." Arca's grip tightened on the detonator. Her glowing eyes narrowed, and she hissed softly, a warning. Logan turned fully now, his gaze locking onto hers. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was careful, measured. "You don't trust me," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "I get it. But if you're planning to blow something up, maybe think twice. You'll hurt yourself more than me." Arca bared her teeth in frustration. He was too calm, too unafraid. It unnerved her. She activated the detonator's pulse, and a low vibration shook the ground between them. The fire flickered wildly, and the trees swayed as if caught in an invisible wind. Logan didn't flinch. Instead, he held his ground and pointed at her belt, his voice steady. "That thing. It's dangerous, isn't it? You're going to blow us both to hell if you're not careful." Arca hesitated. She wasn't used to this. Humans were supposed to panic, to run, to attack. But this one just stood there, talking to her like she was an equal. Her resolve wavered. "I'm not your enemy," Logan said, lowering his voice. He pointed to his pack, which lay open near the fire. Inside, Arca spotted more food, along with a small water flask. "If you're hungry, take it. No tricks. Just don't do something we'll both regret." The vibrating pulse in her hand steadied, the energy fading slightly as her doubt grew. Her glowing eyes darted between him and the pack. Could she risk it? Was it a trap? A sound from the forest shattered her thoughts, a branch snapping underfoot. Logan's head whipped toward the noise, his expression hardening. "They're coming," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Arca's heart raced. She didn't need to ask who they were. The human patrol. Her elders had warned her about their weapons, their ruthlessness. If they found her here, she wouldn't have a chance. Logan turned back to her, urgency in his eyes. "Look, I don't have time to explain, but if they see you, they won't ask questions. You need to go. Now." Arca stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of indecision. Was this another trick? Or was he truly trying to help her? The detonator in her hand buzzed faintly, reminding her of the power she held. But instead of using it, she powered it down, slipping it back into her belt. Logan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Smart choice," he said. "Now, get out of here before." The forest erupted into chaos. Voices echoed through the trees, accompanied by the harsh light of search beams. The patrol was closing in fast. Arca's instincts took over. She bolted into the shadows, her glowing form disappearing among the trees. Logan didn't follow. Instead, he grabbed his pack and kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing it in seconds. He wasn't sure why, but he felt compelled to cover her tracks. As the searchlights approached, Logan stood alone in the dark, his knife at the ready. The patrol burst into the clearing, their weapons drawn. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, his voice sharp. Logan shrugged, his expression neutral. "I heard something, but it was just the wind. You're wasting your time out here." The patrol leader eyed him suspiciously, but Logan's calm demeanor seemed to convince him. With a gruff order, the patrol moved on, their lights fading into the distance. Once they were gone, Logan exhaled deeply and glanced toward the trees where Arca had vanished. He knew this wasn't over. The alien girl wasn't just running from him. She was running from something much bigger. And for some reason, Logan felt like he was now a part of it. An unlikely understanding. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the alien forest in hues of amber and crimson. Logan sat near the edge of the clearing, sharpening his knife, though his mind was far from the task. His thoughts kept drifting to her, the alien girl with the glowing blue skin. He hadn't seen her since the patrol stormed through the night before, but he couldn't shake the feeling she was nearby, watching him. The silence broke with a faint rustle of leaves. Logan froze, his grip tightening on the knife. He kept his movements slow, casual, and spoke without turning around. "I know you're there." The rustling stopped, replaced by the soft hum of something unfamiliar. Logan finally looked up and saw her standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. She held herself differently this time, still cautious, still ready to flee, but not as fearful. "You're brave, coming back here," Logan said, standing slowly and placing his knife on the ground. "Not sure if that's smart or stupid, but it's brave." Arca didn't understand his words, but his tone didn't feel threatening. She glanced around, scanning for traps or hidden patrols. Seeing none, she stepped closer, though her glowing eyes remained wary. Logan pointed to the small bundle near the fire, a portion of dried meat, some fresh water, and a few fruits he'd foraged. "It's for you," he said. Arca tilted her head, unsure of his intentions. She took a cautious step forward, her movements smooth and deliberate. The scent of the food reached her, and her stomach growled audibly, betraying her hunger. Logan smirked. "Yeah, I figured. Go ahead, it's yours." Her glowing eyes darted between him and the food. Slowly, she edged closer, crouched low like a predator stalking prey. Logan stayed perfectly still, his hands open at his sides to show he wasn't a threat. Finally, she reached the bundle and snatched it up, retreating a few steps before examining its contents. The meat disappeared first, devoured with a speed that told Logan just how long it had been since she'd eaten. The water followed, and then the fruit. As she finished, she looked back at Logan, her glowing eyes softer now, though still guarded. She made a sound, not a hiss this time, but a soft, musical hum. Logan blinked, realizing it might be her way of saying something. "You're welcome," he said, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. Arca hesitated, then pointed at him, her clawed finger moving in a slow, deliberate gesture. Logan frowned, unsure what she meant. "What? Me?" he asked. She nodded, or at least it seemed like a nod, and then crouched down, dragging her finger through the dirt. Logan watched, fascinated, as she drew a crude sketch. A circle with small dots inside it, surrounded by jagged lines. Your family. Logan guessed, his voice soft. Arka looked up sharply, surprised by his insight. She nodded again, then tapped the drawing and made a series of musical tones, her voice rising and falling like a song. Logan listened intently, piecing together what he could from her gestures and expressions. "They're trapped. No hiding?" he asked, leaning closer. Arka pointed at the jagged lines surrounding the circle, then mimed something breaking apart with her hands. Logan's stomach sank. The picture told a clear story. Her family was surrounded by danger, and they couldn't escape. "That's why you were stealing food," Logan muttered. "You weren't just scavenging for yourself." Arka tilted her head, clearly confused by his words, but sensing the change in his tone. Logan stood, pacing the edge of the clearing as he processed what he'd just learned. The patrol wouldn't stop looking for her. If they found her family, they'd likely kill them or worse. But if Logan helped her, he'd be putting himself at risk. Not just from the patrol, but from the settlement as well. "You're asking me to help, aren't you?" he said, turning back to her. Arka didn't respond with words, but the look in her eyes was answer enough. Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is a bad idea," he muttered. "Really bad." But then he looked at her again, at the faint scars on her arms, the exhaustion in her glowing eyes, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself despite it all. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help, but you'd better not get me killed." Arka didn't understand his words, but she saw the resolve in his face. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. She reached out, tapping her chest lightly, then pointed at him and made a soft sound. A word, perhaps, or a name. Logan couldn't be sure, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah," he said, "let's start with figuring out how to get your family out of that mess." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the human and the alien sat together in the fading light, two unlikely allies on the brink of something much bigger than either of them realized. The village on alert, the settlement buzzed with tension. News of the alien spread like wildfire after the patrol returned empty-handed. Whispers and speculation filled the air, each tale more exaggerated than the last. "They say it's a beast with glowing eyes that can vanish into thin air," a farmer murmured, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I heard it has claws sharp enough to slice through steel," another added, his voice hushed but insistent. Logan stood near the edge of the gathering, his face impassive as he listened. He hadn't told anyone about his encounter with the alien girl, or the fact that he'd let her go. It wasn't fear of punishment that kept him silent, but something else. He didn't believe she was the monster they described. But not everyone in the settlement shared his doubts. The settlement leader, a stern woman named Clara, addressed the crowd from the center of the square. Her voice carried an edge of authority that demanded attention. "We don't know what this creature wants," Clara said, "but it's been stealing our supplies and evading our patrols. That makes it a threat. We'll double our patrols tonight and set traps along the perimeter. If it comes near, we'll deal with it." No exceptions. The crowd murmured their agreement, the fear in their eyes morphing into something harder, something dangerous. Logan's stomach churned. He knew he couldn't stop the patrols or the traps, but he also knew one thing for certain. Arka and her family wouldn't stand a chance if the settlement found them. Far from the settlement, Arka crouched by the mouth of the cave, watching the horizon. The forest was quiet, but she could feel the tension in the air. Something was happening. Something bad. Her siblings huddled behind her, their small bodies trembling with fear. They hadn't spoken much since she returned, their energy drained by hunger and fear. Arka clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. She had trusted the human, risked everything to ask for his help. But now, as the hours passed with no sign of him, doubt crept into her mind. What if he had betrayed her? What if he had told the others where to find them? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. He had seemed different, kind, even, but her people had always warned her about humans, Could she really afford to trust one? Logan slipped through the forest, his movements quick and deliberate. The patrols were already out, their torches flickering in the distance. He'd overheard their plans. They would sweep the area near the caves tonight, tightening the net around their mysterious threat. He didn't have much time. The path to the cave was rough, the underbrush thick and unforgiving. But Logan knew the terrain well, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating these woods. When he finally reached the clearing near the cave, he paused, scanning the shadows for any sign of her. "Arca," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me. Don't run." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint hum echoed from the darkness. Logan turned toward the sound, and she stepped into the light, her glowing eyes narrowing as she approached. "You came back," Logan said, his voice even. "I wasn't sure you would." Arca didn't respond, but her posture was tense, her body coiled like a spring. Logan raised his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. "Listen," he said, "we don't have much time. The patrols are closing in, and they're heading this way. We need to move your family. Now." Arca tilted her head, her glowing eyes studying him intently. She didn't trust him fully, but she didn't have much of a choice. Slowly, she nodded and gestured toward the cave. Logan followed her inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. 3 smaller aliens, their glowing blue skin dim and pale, huddled together in the back of the cave. They looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, their frail bodies trembling. "They're just kids," Logan muttered under his breath. He turned to Arca, his expression grim. "You've been taking care of them all on your own." Arca didn't need to understand his words to see the shock in his face. She nodded once, her jaw tight. Logan let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said. "We'll figure this out. But we need to move. Fast." He knelt down, pulling a map from his pack and spreading it on the ground. Using simple gestures, he explained his plan. Arca watched closely, her sharp mind piecing together his meaning. It wouldn't be easy, but they had to try. The patrols were getting closer, their voices faint but growing louder. Logan stood, his knife in hand, and looked at Arca. "I'll get you through this," he said. "I promise." For the first time, Arca met his gaze without suspicion. There was no time for words, no time for doubt. Together, they moved into the night, the weight of their fragile alliance heavier than ever. A rescue mission. The forest came alive with the sound of snapping branches and muffled voices. The patrol was closing in, their searchlights cutting through the thick underbrush like blades. Arca's glowing blue skin shimmered faintly in the shadows, but she crouched low, her breathing steady despite the rising tension. She wasn't alone this time. Her siblings clung to her sides, their small forms trembling with fear. Logan crouched beside her, his knife gripped tightly in one hand and a bundle of supplies slung over his shoulder. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "We don't have much time." Arca nodded, her glowing eyes narrowing with determination. Though she didn't understand his words, she understood his urgency. She motioned for her siblings to stay close, her hands moving with a precision born from years of survival. The plan was simple, or as simple as it could be under the circumstances. Logan would lead the patrol away, creating a diversion while Arca and her family slipped through the forest to safety. But the margin for error was razor thin. One misstep, and the patrol would find them all. Logan adjusted the straps of his pack and glanced at Arca. "You ready?" he asked, even though he knew she wouldn't respond. Her gaze flicked to him, and she gave a curt nod. He took that as a yes. "Okay," he muttered. "Let's do this." Logan moved swiftly through the trees, his movements deliberate but loud enough to catch the attention of the patrol. He snapped a branch underfoot and let out a sharp whistle, the sound cutting through the night like a beacon. "Over here," one of the patrolmen shouted. "I heard something." Logan smirked grimly and broke into a run, weaving through the forest with practiced ease. The beams of the searchlights swung wildly, chasing his shadow as he led the patrol away from the cave. The voices grew louder, more frantic, as the patrol scrambled to keep up. Logan's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside. He couldn't afford to falter now, not when Arca and her family were depending on him. Back at the cave, Arca waited until the last of the voices faded into the distance. She motioned for her siblings to follow, her movements precise and silent. The youngest stumbled slightly, his energy drained from days of hunger and fear. Arca caught him, her glowing eyes softening as she whispered a soothing hum. She led them through the forest, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the paths lit by the patrol's searchlights. Her senses were heightened, every sound and movement amplified in her mind. She couldn't let her guard down, not until they were safe. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching toward the sky like silent sentinels. Arca's muscles burned with exhaustion, but she pressed on, driven by the thought of safety for her siblings. Logan, meanwhile, had reached the edge of the forest, the patrol hot on his heels. He ducked behind a large tree, catching his breath as he listened to their shouts. "He's close," one of them yelled. "Spread out." Logan cursed under his breath. They were too organized, too determined. He needed a better distraction, something that would force them to abandon the search entirely. His hand brushed against the small bundle of supplies in his pack, and an idea struck him. He pulled out a flare and lit it, the bright red light illuminating the forest in a fiery glow. He hurled it into the air, watching as it arced high above the trees before landing in the distance. "There!" Another patrolman shouted. "The signal's over there." The group shifted their focus, rushing toward the flare's landing point. Logan allowed himself a small, grim smile before slipping away, his movements swift and silent. By the time Logan reached the designated meeting point, the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. Arca and her siblings were already there, huddled together in the shadows. Their glowing forms seemed dimmer, their exhaustion evident. Logan approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. Arca's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or mistrust. Gratitude. "You made it," he said softly, crouching beside them. He pulled the remaining supplies from his pack and handed them to Arca. "It's not much, but it'll get you through the next few days." Arca accepted the supplies, her hand steady despite her weariness. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and touched his arm lightly, a gesture of thanks. Logan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or hope. He wasn't sure what was driving him to help these strangers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away now. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice firm. "But we've got a chance. Let's make it count." Arca didn't understand his words, but the determination in his voice was clear. Together, they moved deeper into the forest, their fragile alliance growing stronger with every step. New bonds and new futures. The sky was a tapestry of stars, their light faint against the encroaching dawn. Arca sat with her siblings near a small, hidden stream, her glowing blue skin dimmed from exhaustion. The air was still, but it carried the faint echoes of voices in the distance. The patrol was still searching, relentless in their pursuit. Logan crouched nearby, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. His knife was at his side, but his focus wasn't on defense anymore. It was on survival, not just for himself, but for the fragile family he had stumbled into protecting. "We don't have long," he said quietly, glancing at Arca. "They'll figure out we're not where the flare was soon enough." Arca didn't respond in words, but her glowing eyes locked onto his, steady and unyielding. In the past few days, they had developed a strange form of communication. Gestures, expressions, and trust. Now, that trust was being tested to its limits. Logan shifted his attention to the children. They were huddled together, their faintly glowing forms almost invisible in the shadows. One of them was coughing, a soft, wheezing sound that made Logan's chest tighten. "They're not going to make it much longer like this," he muttered. "We need a real plan." The patrol, meanwhile, was closing in. Clara, the settlement leader, moved with a determined pace, her torchlight slicing through the underbrush. She wasn't about to let a rogue alien threaten her people. The signs were clear. Someone had been helping the creature. Someone from the settlement. Her jaw tightened as she motioned for her team to spread out. "Keep your eyes open," she ordered. "We're close." Logan's mind raced as he knelt by the stream, washing his hands and face to clear his thoughts. He had already risked everything by helping Arca. If the settlement found out, he'd be branded a traitor, or worse. But looking at the fragile children clinging to their sister, he couldn't regret his decision. "We need to keep moving," he said, turning back to Arca. He grabbed a stick and drew a crude map in the dirt, pointing to a mountain range in the distance. "There's an old supply shelter there. It's abandoned, but it'll give us cover." Arca tilted her head, studying the map. She pointed to the mountain and made a soft, questioning hum. "Yes," Logan said, nodding. "It's far, but it's safe." Arca hesitated, glancing at her siblings. Their glowing eyes were dim with fatigue, their small bodies trembling. She clenched her fists, then gave Logan a firm nod. They would try. The journey was grueling. The children were too weak to walk for long, so Logan took turns carrying the smallest one, his muscles aching but his resolve unwavering. Arca kept pace beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the forest for danger. Despite their exhaustion, they moved with purpose, their shared goal binding them together. But as they neared the mountain, the faint sound of voices reached their ears. Logan froze, holding up a hand to stop the group. The patrol had caught up. "We have to hide," Logan whispered. He scanned the terrain, his mind racing. Nearby, a cluster of rocks jutted out from the base of the mountain, their shadows deep enough to conceal them. He motioned for Arca to follow, but as they moved toward the rocks, a searchlight swept over the area. The patrol had spotted them. "There," the voice shouted. Arca's siblings screamed in fear, their glowing forms making them easy targets. Logan pulled his knife, his jaw clenched as the patrol closed in. He knew they didn't stand a chance in a fight, but he wasn't going to give up without trying. Arca, however, had other ideas. She stepped forward, her glowing blue skin flaring brightly. Her voice rose into a high melodic hum, the sound resonating through the forest like a ripple in still water. Logan stared in shock as the patrol hesitated, their weapons faltering as the hum grew louder, more intense. The light from Arca's skin became blinding, forcing the patrol to shield their eyes. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the trees swaying as if responding to her call. Logan felt a strange warmth wash over him, a sense of calm and safety that defied the chaos around them. When the light faded and the hum subsided, the patrol was gone, their footsteps retreating into the distance. Logan turned to Arca, his mouth open in stunned disbelief. What was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arca didn't answer. She simply looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with a quiet strength. For the first time, Logan realized just how powerful she truly was, and how much she had been holding back to protect her siblings. Hours later, they reached the abandoned shelter at the mountain's base. It was little more than a dilapidated structure, but to Logan and Arca, it felt like salvation. The children collapsed onto the soft ground inside, their breathing steadying as they finally allowed themselves to rest. Logan sat by the entrance, his knife in hand, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Arca joined him, her glowing skin faint but steady. She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. Logan glanced at her, surprised by the gesture. "What?" he asked, his voice soft. Arca made a low hum, her eyes meeting his. Though he couldn't understand her words, the meaning was clear. "Thank you." Logan smiled faintly and leaned back against the wall. "You're welcome," he said, "but this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the human and the alien sat side by side, two unlikely allies bound by trust, sacrifice, and the hope for a better future.